So welcome everybody. I see some new faces and new names, as well as our regular pilgrims who are with us. Thank you, Rick and Molly, and Dr. Wood, as well as Karen Broadhead for leading the Rosary with Father Tony for us today. And Barbara, we're glad that you're joining us. We know that you were supposed to lead the first decade, and we were worried about you, so we're glad that you were able to be with us today. And welcome to all the new fellow pilgrims with us. Jan Bentz is with us, Dr. Bentz. He is going to lead us on this mystery pilgrimage. And so why is it a mystery pilgrimage? Well, it's a mystery pilgrimage because when we were setting the schedule, Dr. Bentz was very busy traveling. He has been all over Europe, and in fact, he's going to be with us just for an hour because he and his family will be traveling in the morning to the States. So I'm going to let him get going on it and to tell us where we're going, because when we were scheduling this day, he wasn't really sure where we were going to go. So we made it a mystery pilgrimage to give him time to understand better where he wanted to bring us. And so without any further delay, I introduce Dr. Bentz. You're with us, correct, Dr. Bentz?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Hi, Deborah. Hi, everybody. Hi, Father. Thank you for the rosary. So I just joined at the end. I usually like to pray it, but we are indeed in the kind of last steps of packing and all of that. And so with a 10-month-old, everything takes a little bit longer. So we're departing tomorrow very early. So yes, to you now. So we are today visiting the very important and very major Basilica of St. Paul outside the wall. Now, for some of you may have joined us already on our tour to St. Peter's Basilica, and so I thought it was the natural succession to visit St. Paul's outside the walls. In fact, Deborah, I think now that we have set the schedule, I can also announce that we'll also visit the other major basilicas, and then we'll have dedicated to the Vatican museums. The Vatican museums are very, very large, so we'll do those in segments, which I think is most manageable, most digestible to all of you. So today,
that is correct. I think we scheduled the Vatican museums in a 4-part series beginning in October.
That's right, exactly.
And so we have some other ones leading up. So we encourage you to check our Inside the Vatican pilgrimage website, the page. Mary, the moderator, will put it in our chat so you can see the updated schedule, which was just updated last night. So thank you, Dr. Bentz.
You're very welcome. So it's my pleasure, really. Yes. So St. Paul. Well, maybe Deborah, you can do the traveling, since you got to fly over.
Going back to Italy, to Rome. We always like to give people the lay of the land, and here you see Rome, of course, with the Beltway, the Ricordo that goes around Rome, and you see the spot, the little stamp in the middle, which is Vatican City, St. Peter's Basilica, and then, of course, you can see the second arrow pointing to St. Paul's outside the wall. Well, Jan and I will sometimes disagree on what we walk to and what we don't in Rome. This is where we do agree. We do not walk to St. Paul's outside the wall. A real pilgrim would just shake their head at us, but it is a bit of a walk, and it's a lot of traffic and different types of roads. And so it's a 4-mile walk if you were to walk, just to give you an idea of the distance. Again, Rome is really not that large of a city, so it is doable to walk if you would like. And then here we are. Jan?
Very good. So yes, and that is actually the first indicator of the importance of this basilica, or rather one of the most interesting features of this basilica is that it is outside the walls. So we are dealing with the second most important church in Christianity, potentially maybe the third if you count the Lateran, which we will visit as well one of these next weeks. But St. Paul's is outside the walls, unlike St. Peter's Basilica, St. Mary's Christianity, in Rome. St. Paul's is outside the walls because St. Paul died outside the walls. And so this basilica lets us enter into the story of early Christianity, and not just early Christianity, but also early churches. Okay, what is a basilica in general? We can talk about this today. So who greets us here in the middle that you see entering the atrium is St. Paul himself. Now, if we look at this shot, I may want to point out that it looks very different from St. Peter's Basilica, but it only really looks different from the modern St. Peter's Basilica. The first, can we go back one more? The first St. Peter's Basilica looked actually very much like St. Paul's. Okay, so you have the main nave, as you can see, you can see the facade, right, which is kind of the main large nave, and then you have the side naves, right, and in the front is a square atrium. Julius II in the early 16th century for St. Peter's changed all of that. He razed the whole thing to the ground and built a new one. That's the one that we see today with a dome and everything. The first St. Peter's looked very similar to St. Paul's outside the walls. Now, where we're standing is the atrium, so it's the reception hall. Okay, it's the place where you would still come when you would visit the first part that you would see of the church. You can see the facade and the most important apostle. Now, from the 2nd century on, we have documentation that people visited this church, and it's not easy. Okay, it's not easy. You have to walk a long way from the inner city to get to here. And oftentimes pilgrims had already walked quite a distance till they got to Rome. They would finally arrive in the city. They would finally see all the church. They would see St. Peter's Basilica. They would see the Lateran. They would see Mary Major. They would see all the big squares, Piazza Navona and Piazza del Popolo. And then they would still take this long journey upon them, crossing the Tiber River and actually leaving on the Via Ostia, so one of the big, or Via Ostiense, one of the big streets leading out of Rome from antiquity, going in a long line, okay, to St. Paul's. So we had from the 2nd century an ongoing stream of pilgrims that we are joining today, almost 2,000 years after it has built. Not quite, 600 years after it had been built. So who greets us when we get, after this long journey over the Tiber, along the Via Ostiense? Who greets us is the Apostle Paul himself. So that is the man of the hour, obviously, and as you know, also one of the most important saints for the church and for Christianity. So when we look at this church, we'll basically have to take what we have to take away as dates, okay, is the first erection of the church, which is 64 AD, and it was very small. It was just a kind of a chapel, really, just like a one-room kind of chapel, like a roof, okay, almost like St. Peter's Basilica was, the so-called trophy, so just like a tiny baldacchino in the middle of a grave, or on top of a grave, which was St. Paul's grave. And then you had really an embellishing in the 8th century. Sorry. So you had the first small atrium, then you had the Constantinian Basilica, and the Constantinian Basilica was enlarged in the 8th century. So you had the year 64 or 67, the death of St. Paul. You had Constantine with Sylvester I. So in the middle of the 4th century, about 310, and then you have the big embellishment from the 8th century. So what we see today is the 8th century church. Now, there is one more date, which is unfortunate, a very unfortunate date, a very fateful day of this basilica, which is the year 1823. Not so long ago, really. Okay, so between 800 or 795 and 1823, the basilica remained pretty much unchanged, which is also for Rome very special. And we see this in other churches that have been constantly restored and remade and remodeled and all of that. In this church, not much has actually changed. So what we see today is, in fact, the blueprint of the original church, which is very special for that reason. What happened in 1823? In 1823, there were workers on the roof. Okay, there were workers trying to fix some holes that had, come about because the wood got really dry and got got holes and they had worms and all that. So they needed to rebuild part of the roof, and one of the workers dropped a burning coal down into the roof. And he let the midday, and there was this in July. So July in Rome is a very dry month, very hot month. And as you can imagine, and that didn't end well. The roof caught on fire, the whole basilica caught on fire, and we basically had the image of what you've seen maybe a couple of months ago when you watched TV. You saw the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris burn. And that is the same that happened to this church. So in 1823, this whole church burned down. And since it had been very old, the walls collapsed, the roof collapsed, the facade collapsed, everything kind of collapsed onto itself, and it had to be rebuilt. It was very, very fateful night because it was also the last night of Pope Pius VII on earth. It was the night he was dying, and it's very famous that the Pope was actually not informed about St. Paul burning down, because having to deal with Napoleon all of his life, his servants and the priests around him said, okay, we don't have to burden him on his deathbed with this. So Pius VII died in the same day that this basilica burned down, and so what happened is that his successor Gregory XVI was kind of called to rebuild it. So he started, and then it was rebuilt by Leo XII, which is the successor of Gregory. Now, what's very interesting is that in 1823, okay, we're in the middle of the 19th century, and so, I'm sorry, I'm just giving you kind of a grand scheme before we go into the actual church, but this is important to understand the importance of this church, the context of this church. And in 1823, we're in the middle of the 19th century, okay? A church burning down means that church is gone. No one cares. We're in the middle of the 19th century. Enlightenment has happened. Secularization has happened. You had all of the kind of religious tensions already, and everyone said, okay, well, this church, we don't have time, we don't have money, we just don't have money. The Pope said we don't have money to rebuild this church. It's just not going to happen. We can maybe restore from the ruins. We can restore some small, but that's it. And so what happened is that the Pope called out to the world and said, look, this very important church has burned down. What can we do? And all of a sudden, from all over the world, from Catholics, from Protestants, yes, even from Muslims, donations were collected to rebuild the church. Okay, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, huge donation of stones, of marble. You have King Fuad of Egypt. You had Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the prince, giving alabaster to rebuild the church. And you're sitting there like, the Pope said that, like, what is happening? Like, why are all of these people interested in rebuilding the church? This is crazy. So he got all of the material, he got all of the money together, he got all the donations together, and he could, in fact, rebuild it and reconsecrate it in 1854. So just about 20 years, or 30 years, 31 years. Which is incredible, okay, from the 8th century, but rebuilt. That's why everything is so looks so new, okay, looks so clean, because it is. It's just 150 years old. But it was built according to the original plan. Some of the stones were incorporated, some of the artwork was preserved, so you could incorporate that as well. So who are we going to? And now we can go to the next slide. Sorry to stick so much on this one, aware of the importance of this church. So we are going to visit, hopefully this is not too politically correct, that Christianity, okay, without St. Paul is fundamentalism, okay? You need both. And thanks. And so this man is really the guarantee that there's always a balance of power with St. Peter, with the Pope, and reason, okay? And Paul was the apostle of the Gentiles. He was the one that obviously would go around, he would preach to the Jews, he would always go to the synagogues, he would preach the good news of Christ that he had, that, he was converted of. And you remember, Paul was the one that persecuted Christians and then converted. So he started as Saul, right? Remember that? And then became Paul. After his vision, falling from the horse and all of that, you know the story. And so Paul Paul evangelized. Okay, that was his main kind of mission, and he also evangelized those that are not Jewish. And this was actually, I think, one of the most significant changes in the early churches. The first council of the church, I don't know if you're aware of that, but St. Paul took part in it, which is the Council of Jerusalem. And that was a council in the year 50, where they decided, and they took St. Paul's advice, they took St. Paul's theological approach, saying that the Christians did not have to follow all of the regulations of the Torah. So, for example, the Talmudic law or the Torah law. So they did, for example, not have to circumcise. Okay, that was decided at the Council of Jerusalem, effectively opening Christianity to the Gentiles, to the world. It was not just kind of a small segment of the Jewish religion anymore, but it was something that was open to everyone. It was a large, welcoming body of people where everyone could join. So Saint Paul is really the one that is responsible for that. So here we see him. I don't know, some of you may not get the reference. It's a pop culture reference, but I always like to call him the Jedi Saint Paul. Okay, because he looks like a Sith Lord, and that's fine. If you get the Star Wars reference, good for you. If you don't, never mind. Don't worry about it. So Saint Paul is really significant for the church, and obviously his letters are part of the New Testament. So if you do grab your Bible, you'll find his letters. At the very end. Good. So this church then welcomes us into the heavenly mystery. And we've kind of spoken about this idea of entering a church means entering heaven, right? And you already have that here in the facade. So what we see, this beautiful mosaic facade, is Jesus Christ in the middle, Peter and Paul left and right. And this is something, sorry to go back to this point, but Peter and Paul are always together. Okay, we have stories of artists in Rome like Caravaggio or Michelangelo who basically refused to do one saint and not the other. There's a famous story of Caravaggio. He was commissioned to paint St. Peter, and he said, no, I'm not going to paint St. Peter. I'm going to paint St. Peter and St. Paul. And while Caravaggio was obviously also interested in getting more commissions, understandably, he kind of struck a nerve with the Romans, because they knew if you only do St. Peter, it's not quite right. If you only do St. Paul, not quite right. So you always have Peter and Paul. And so here you have Jesus Christ, Peter on the left with the keys in his hands, Paul on the right with a sword in his hands. The sword because he's a fighter for God, but also because he was beheaded, right, by the sword. Underneath, the lamb, the apocalyptic lamb, and the 12 sheep representing kind of all of mankind coming to Christ, and the two cities, Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Obviously, down below, you have the four most important prophets of the Old Testament. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And that's also kind of a common theme. So that's the beautiful facade that welcomes us into this church. Now maybe we can go through to the portico. And here we have the main gate. And again, it looks very fresh. It looks very new. That's because it's rebuilt. But again, the structure is the main structure of the original church. And what you see here is the main gate. So you have the cross, and it's all metal. Okay, it's all bronze, but some of it is highlighted, specifically the two saints, Peter and Paul. And so you have the life of Peter on the left, and you have the life of Paul on the right. Again, you cannot speak of St. Peter without speaking of St. Paul. Maybe I can give you a little anecdote. I don't know if you were aware of that, but the Catholic Church celebrates the feasts of Peter and Paul on the same day, right? Which is sometime in June. And I should have looked that up. Deborah, do you know when is celebrated Peter and Paul?
June 29th.
Okay, well, I got the month, so that's good. June 29th. Why is their feast celebrated on the same day? Deborah, do you know this?
No, I'm sure that I don't.
I can't ask anyone else. So you will be my go-to person. But it's celebrated on the same day because both of the apostles are supposed to have died on the same day, right? Now, this is something very interesting, and I think I mentioned this in a tour before, but nonetheless, I can repeat it now that we hear in St. Paul's Church. Having died on the same day makes both saints be born in heaven on the same day. people who are born on the same day are twins. So you have the new founding fathers of Christian Rome. Remember Romulus and Remus, the twins from ancient Rome? Well, now you got St. Peter and St. Paul, the new twins, the Christian twins. Not twins on earth, not from the same mother, but twins in heaven. Okay, both born of the same father, of the Father in heaven. So you have the twins in heaven, and so this basilica basically speaks about these twins all day, okay, with everything that we see. So you can see Peter and Paul here on the main gate, leading us into the church. A little side note as well, the church, if you look at it from a bird's eye perspective, from the bird's eye view, okay, and you look at it from on a map of Rome, you can see that the church actually faces St. Peter's. Okay, St. Peter's is oriented north, and St. Paul's is oriented west. They're facing one another like bookends, okay, over Rome. So they're looking at one another. Peter knows, there's Paul, and Paul knows, there's Peter, and all of the Christian pilgrims go back and forth between these two. Very good. Well, let's go inside. We've spent too much time outside anyways. It's getting really hot, and you all probably are very thirsty. Very good. So this is the main view, right? The main view of the main aisle. Deb, you have been to the church before, right?
Yes.
Can you like explain like maybe the feeling that you have when you go in for the first time, like just kind of what?
Exactly. In fact, yesterday when Jan and I were reviewing the slides, I personally didn't like this particular slide because it gave a very distorted view for those who've not been to St. Paul outside the wall. Because when you walk inside, it is so vast. This photo seems to be taken midway up. So we couldn't find a photo really all the way from the back. It's just so vast. It really is. And then you look far down the main aisle there, the main part of the church, and you see this baldacchino. It's really quite extraordinary. It really is. It's very simple, but yet it's very beautiful. You don't have a lot. Rarely do you walk in and see any chairs or pews there. Typically, Mass, when it's celebrated here, is behind the baldacchino, very much like in St. Peter's, which is the altar of the chair.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly the sentiment that basically everyone has that goes inside. And it's funny because the church is actually a tiny bit smaller than St. Peter's, but everyone who walks into this church, the first thing they says, gosh, it is vast. It is so big. And I always ask myself, like, well, it's actually not that big if you compare to St. Peter's. St. Peter's is bigger, like you're quite a bit bigger, but you don't feel that. But here you feel it, and it's very nice that they usually leave the chairs out, which they put in obviously if you have a big mass there, but they leave it out so you really get this feeling. And so I think it will be an opportune time to speak about a basilica, right? What is a basilica? And if you look at this layout, it basically looks like a shoebox, okay, like a very oversized shoebox. And the idea is it's a long rectangle. You entered one part, and then you look all the way at the end. And who is at the end? Who is at the end? Well, you have to ask yourself where the basilica comes from. The basilica is not a Christian invention, it's a pagan invention. And so in Rome, you had multiple basilicas before Christians even arrived in Rome. And those basilicas served for the emperor to receive guests or to receive gifts. So the emperor could sit on his throne at the very end, and so you'd walk in and you would walk into a space that is taken up by his ego, right? That is taken up by this person, this mythical god emperor. And so then you would go, kind of duck in like, oh gosh, this is all really fancy and really big. And you would go down long hallway, and then you would, give your little gift or your greeting, I don't know, from your uncle to the emperor, and then you would go through. And you would circle around through the side naves and you would go back out. And the Christians, when they had to find a style of church, when they started building a style of building, I should say, for their churches, which style, they could have picked many styles. There were many styles in Rome, but they picked the Basilica because they said, this is perfect. It's a huge space. We are many, so we need a lot of space. Everyone needs to fit inside. Number one. Number two, we are visiting the emperor, but not the emperor of the Roman Empire, but the emperor of, well, the cosmos and the universe. And it's very practical. Okay, you go in. It's centered, so you have an axiality, right? It has an axis. It has a clear orientation. There is nothing to distract you. You go straight to the king of the universe, the king of the kingdom of God, and then you circle around and you go back out. Right. So, and obviously that king comes to visit you on the altar. So, what we see then as ornaments or as decorations is you have the baldacchino right above the altar, and you have the big triumphal arch on top. And I think this would be a good time to speak about the triumphal arch. Is the next picture, I think, is the view backwards. Yes, there you go. So if you actually go to the triumphal arch and you look back through the main gate, that's what you look at. Okay, and here you can get the sense of the size a little bit better because there are also people there and they're very small. So you get an idea of the size. What is very cool are those 6 pillars in the back. They're kind of standing. They're kind of like standing around. They don't really seem like they're doing anything. But also the pillars of the king of Egypt, King Fuad I, who's Muslim, who gifted those columns for the rebuilding of the church. Okay, so
Jan, you broke up just
one of the gifted things in their alabaster, of the size. Oh, I hope that.
Can you hear me, Jan?
Sorry, one second. Yep, I can. Okay, I just realized that my computer wasn't plugged in. That may have been the issue. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me better?
I can hear you better now. I think you were explaining that these columns were a gift of the king of Egypt.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Sorry about the connectivity. My internet should be pretty strong, but there's always modems. It's like unexplained unstable connections. Okay, so yes, these were a gift by King Fuad I of Egypt, so a Muslim, that fundamentally wanted to contribute something to the answering the cry for help of the Pope, and so he granted he gifted them these 6 alabaster columns, very, very fancy. Okay, so the Pope put them in at the very entrance. So it's the first thing that you see if you look left and right, you going in, right? So that's why they're there. Perfect. All right, let's turn back around, and let's look at the.
Before we do, I always like to show people the floor and the ceiling. I don't think I have a photo of the floor, but the ceiling in St. Paul's is so beautiful that I wanted people to at least see the intricate detail in the ceiling.
Yes. Yes, it's quite fancy. It's gilded wood. Okay. And so it's wood, basically wood carving that then you slap on some gold, which is quite nice. So for any interior decorators among you, if you still have time, then do this in your living room. Guests will be impressed. Very good. Now, one of the things that you see when you go and look at the main nave is all of those medallions of the popes, right? So left and right, you have the medallions of all of the popes. Deborah, do you know how many popes?
200 and what's the exact number?
266.
266. I was going to say.
Very good. 266. So these are all of the popes in chronological sequence from the first pope, Saint Peter, that we see here, Sanctus Petrus, okay, from the beginning to the current pope, to Pope Francis. So you have all of the mosaics. Some of them are actually original from the First Basilica. Most of them are reconstructed. You can see them here going around right underneath the windows. It's all of the popes going in sequence, and they go all the way around. Okay, so on the inside aisle, and then the outside aisle, and the back aisle. There you go, the back aisle, and they arrive at Pope Francis. So, and obviously, yes, there are still empty spots. I think at this point there are about 12 of them, but theoretically there's more space, and so there's obviously a famous Roman legend that if you run out of space, then the end of the world will come. So, which is tricky because you could technically also continue on the outside of the church. I mean, there's an endless kind of back and forth. It's like, Snake, like the computer game, just go back and forth and, be fine. Anyways,
Exactly. There is a
so
lot
this
of space. So that's one of the things that some pilgrims, when we bring them into this remarkable basilica, they always ask. This particular mosaic of Pope Francis, we happened to be staying inside the Vatican, and we stopped one afternoon to see our friends in the Mosaic Studio right after Francis became Pope, about a month later, and they were actually working on this mosaic. They were almost completed, so we got to see them make this actual mosaic. It was quite extraordinary. It's quite large, of course, because it's so high up. But there is still a working mosaic studio in the Vatican, and they are the ones who not only create new mosaics, but also repair the old ones.
Yes, exactly. And that's also something important to point out, because a mosaic studio in the Vatican is actually quite significant, quite famous. It's the only really working mosaic studio in the world of that size. So it's quite fancy. So yeah, here you have Benedict, Francis, and then you have the empty slot. And so whenever a pope is selected, then he gets his mosaic. The question came up in the chat if any of the popes did not make the lineup, and no, all of the popes are represented here. So these are 266 medallions. So that's all of the popes. Some of them shorter. Okay, some of the early 8th, 9th century, some of the popes just reigned for a couple of months, but they're still there. Some of them have very cool names. Hyginus is always a great one. There's just one of Hyginus, because I don't really know why you would call yourself Hyginus. It's like, well, I mean, during Corona actually made sense. Maybe we have an next pope, Hyginus II. It's like, well, we're a very hygienic pope. So, can we go back one more time to the Triumphal Arch? I'm sorry, before we go, yeah, sorry, we end all the popes, but I want to go back to the Triumphal Arch for a second before we actually go to the tomb of Paul himself. I think it's one more back. Nope. Okay, two more back. And because the Triumphal Arch in the church is always very significant, there we go. The Triumphal Arch is the proper entrance into the sanctuary, which is the proper entrance into heaven. And so it's always good to focus our attention at this Triumphal Arch. Also because this is going to be the meanest Jesus that you'll see in Rome. Okay, he had a really bad day. Okay, hot water was out. He had to take a cold shower, and you can see it. So you have Jesus in the middle. You have mean Jesus in the middle. Okay, and then you have the four evangelists, all with their symbols on top. So on the far left, going from left to right, you have an ox for Saint Luke. You have a man or an angel for Matthew. On the right, you have a lion for Saint Mark, and then you have the eagle for John. Okay, so the four evangelists in their imagery, and then you have a bunch of people in white robes. Where do you find the story about these strange elderly people in white robes? Those are the 24 elders. And I'm putting this out because this has still something to do with St. Paul. St. Paul opened Christianity to the Gentiles. And as you know, most of us are Gentiles, right? We're not Jews that converted. So we are all Gentile Christians. So we all kind of own our Christianity to Paul in that sense. And these 24 elders represent the 12, so that they appear in the Apocalypse. And they go to the Lamb, right? They join the Lamb. And those 24 elders represent the 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles, together signifying all of mankind. The 24 apocalyptic elders, the 24 persons kind of, standing in place of all mankind. Underneath, again, you have Peter and Paul on the mosaic. And then on the very bottom, the two statues, again, you have Peter and Paul. And if you're attentive and you look at a picture of St. Peter's Square, then you can see the same statues of Peter and Paul on St. Peter's Square. So it's also, again, a nice reference to St. Peter's. St. Peter's Basilica with the statues outside, St. Paul's Basilica with the statues inside. So now, I think without further ado, we can actually go to the crypt of St. Paul. Now, when the basilica burned down, Obviously, up to that point, you couldn't really dig up the tomb of St. Paul, but the reconstruction of it in 1823 up until 1854 allowed archaeologists to dig deeper, literally. And so they found a sarcophagus. So that a sarcophagus is a very fancy ancient Roman coffin, basically, made in stone. And so they found a sarcophagus. On that sarcophagus, it said, Petros Apostolos Mart, which means Peter the Apostle, a martyr. And so they opened it with a tiny, tiny incision. And you have to be very careful, because if you have a sarcophagus of that age and you open it, okay, since some of them were hermetically sealed, what happens is that the content turns to dust. So you got to be careful. You don't get the nice suction noise, like, and there goes St. Paul. Now they didn't do that. They made a tiny incision through an airtight space, okay, with rubber kind of blocking it, and sent a camera in. And with the camera, they could see bone remains, and a sequence of purple and gold robe. And so that signifies that whatever was laid in the tomb was laid here on account or on command of the emperor, because only the emperor could govern over the color purple and gold. We've spoken about this in a previous tour. So there was something imperial in here. Now, could it have been a fake? Sure. Did first century Christians know that sometime in the very far future someone would need to identify these bones as St. Paul, and so they're put in something? Potentially. Very unlikely. Okay, Christians have been here for 1,800 years, relying on kind of mouth-to-mouth tradition of other Christians. So it's very likely that these are original. Anyways, there have been studies on this, tons of Italian books published when the Basilica was rebuilt. So you can research that on your own, but we assume that these are the remains of St. Paul. So what you see is the main altar. Okay, you have the baldacchino, and then underneath is the tomb. And I think we have another picture that actually goes on. So we actually need to go down the stairs. Here we go, small staircase. There you go. And now we can join all of the other pilgrims, and we can look into the tomb of St. Peter. Now, the actual sarcophagus is visible behind that grid. Okay, so you see a grid here on the left side, and in that grid, on the right side here, you can see the sarcophagus top. Okay, and then underneath there's a little black slit, and there's a tiny plaque, and the plaque says the Apostle Peter. On the left side, in this image, on the left top side, you can see a reliquary, okay, a golden box, basically, that has a chain inside, and that's the chain with which Paul was chained in prison in his time in Rome. Okay, so that prison, there's another church that is close to that prison, which is San Pietro in Vincoli, which just means Saint Peter in chains in English. And so that was the place where, very close to the place where he was put in prison, because you know that Paul spent some time in the Caesarean prison sentence. Okay, so he had to, and he actually came to Rome to defend himself against the allegations done by the Roman emperor. So those are the chains. Now down below, so basically then there's three significant things that we can see here. You have the chains on top, you have the grid with a sarcophagus in the middle, and on the bottom you have another kind of cutout, and see where the gentleman kind of reaches in, there is a glass, so he's touching the glass, and people mistake that. That's not the tomb of St. Paul. What that is actually the construction of the first basilica. Okay, so the very, very, very first one in the year 70, and it's very small. It's basically a private chapel of a noble's house, and it was actually oriented the other way. So if you look very, very close, you have to look in the right bottom corner, you can see a curve, okay, like a curvature, the stone being cut in a curve. And so that was actually the back side of that chapel. Okay, so there's a round wall, okay, and that's the back side of that first chapel. So the church, when it was constructed by Constantine, was turned around specifically for the purpose that I told you in the beginning, to face St. Peter's. So it was basically just turned around. The sarcophagus stayed in the same place, but the church got a reorientation. So now again, you can look through the grid in the back. You can see the slit, and there we go. During the Pauline year, they did have it open, or if you have special guests or archaeologists that need to go in, you open the grid, and so there you can see that's the actual sarcophagus. So that stone slab at the very end of that box, that's the outside of Paul's sarcophagus. So the sarcophagus is actually underneath the altar. Okay, and so I have a friend in the community of Benedictines that lives in St. Paul's, and so I was so excited. I was like a little fanboy, like, oh, he said, oh, I'm going to open the altar for you. So the outside of the altar has a like a door, and you can open it. So they open it, and so the altar is empty. Okay, it's actually empty. It's an empty space, and you can see the top of the sarcophagus. And so he did that for me and my students when we were there, and we're like, oh, we are so happy because no one gets to see that. So other people actually came in and kind of snuck in and took a peek. You know, it's like, you don't belong to my group, but you know, obviously, you want to share the joy. So that was a very cool moment. So, anyways, but that's the sarcophagus. Okay, now at this point, maybe I can take a brief break. If there are any questions, Deborah, of you, or maybe you can post some questions.
I unfortunately cannot see the chat, so if
I can see the chat. So,
are there any questions? Anybody have any questions? Now's a good time to put some questions in chat if you have any for Dr. Bentz.
So yeah, one of the questions was, I already answered that, is if any of the popes didn't make the lineup. No, all of them are present there. Linda Smith says incredible photos and story. It is incredible. We're all part of it. We're all part of the church, so it's quite nice. This is our heritage, right? You can be very proud of it. Good. I think there are no other questions so far, so that's good. All right. Where can we find all of the people that took place in the rebuilding, the countries? All right. I believe so. I think there exists a list, even on the website, but definitely in the Vatican archives, of all of the donations. Okay, the Vatican keeps very close track of those kind of things, including all of the gifts that are given to the popes, even to the current pope of all popes.
The Vatican has a great website, and because this is a major basilica, it's part of the Vatican. It's a subsection of the Vatican website, and they have a lot of information there. So and you know it's the Vatican website if it's .va. So I would suggest go there and look, and you probably might find something there, because they do put a lot of relevant and historical archives. Actually, you will find some of the archives there as well. So. Yep. It's a good starting point.
Exactly. So then we have two more questions. One is, what are the 12 apostles and 12 tribes carrying in their hands? So what are the 24 elders carrying in their hands? They're carrying little oil lamps in their hands. And this is reminiscent of the New Testament story of the virgins, right? The virgins that come, some that have enough oil for the lamps and some that don't. And obviously all of the apocalyptic elders have enough oil, so they get invited to the wedding feast. So they're having these kind of small lights in their hand. Another question is, where's the Blessed Sacrament Chapel? The Blessed Sacrament Chapel is, I don't think that we have a photo of it. I don't know, Deborah, if you...
I didn't have time. I wanted to show people. It's to the left. It's to the left. And it's the one part of the church that did not completely burn down. It's also a very special chapel. Glad you asked the question. Because in that chapel is the crucifix that turned its head and spoke to Saint Bridget of Sweden. She would come out there. Many saints would come to this basilica, and she would spend hours in that chapel. It's also in that chapel you will find the mosaic that Saint Ignatius of Loyola, with his first few followers, they gave their first vows in front of this mosaic of Mary. It's a very special chapel. And when you go to this basilica, when you find the local Italians, they will be in that chapel praying. So
that's very true. Very true. And
we'll do more on that chapel in coming up pilgrimage on Saint Bridget of Sweden, because she's just such a remarkable saint. She carried on most people don't realize that Saint Catherine of Siena carried on the work of bringing the Pope back to Rome. That was Saint Bridget of Sweden started that work. So anyway.
Very nice. Right. Good. So The main abscess mosaic. First of all, some of you have been on my previous tour. You do know that. So I just want to remind you that the abs mosaic always signifies paradise, Eden, right? So you have not just Eden, not just earthly paradise, but heavenly paradise. So what you have is you have a framework of plants. Very simple. You have a bunch of palm trees and you have a bunch of vegetation. Because what's paradise? It's a garden, and what's in a garden? A bunch of plants. There you go. So that's the framework of it, basically. Then you have the name of the Pope, in whose name the basilica is dedicated, which is right top center, and his name is Honorius III. And I'll give you $50 if you can find Pope Honorius III in the mosaic. Luckily, I'm not with you, so you're not, hopefully. But I'm going to tell you before you can find him, which is to the right feet of Jesus. If you look at Jesus, Jesus is very big, and then you have a tiny guy wrapped in white.
Yeah.
That's Pope Honorius III.
Oh.
And I love it. It's like the minuscule Pope. It's such a great, like artists back, like mosaic and artists had such a great fun with the truths of the faith. They're not like these stuck-up people, but they were like, okay, who's really important? We're gonna make really big. Who's really insignificant? We're gonna make really small. And they did it. So who's really important? Jesus. There you go. So Jesus in the middle. Who's very insignificant in comparison to Jesus, unfortunately, is the Pope. So the Pope is like to the feet of Jesus and kissing Jesus's like toe. As a sign of reference, and I always love that, like the tiny white Pope. Anyway, so this mosaic is partly original of the first church, but it had to be reconstructed in a large part after the fire. Unfortunately, the original parts are by Pietro Cavallini, a very famous mosaic artist of the 13th century Rome. So who do we see? They're all named, so for tour guides, it's very easy. So you have St. Luke on the left, you have St. Paul, then you have Jesus Christ in the middle, you have St. Peter, right? Peter and Paul. Hello, there you go. You have the twins, and then on the far right you have Andrew. All of them holding scrolls in their hand, talking about the divinity of Christ, which is the most important thing. Now, maybe also I can talk about Jesus for one moment, his hand gesture, which is a little bit funky. Okay, this is like the secret, kind of the secret handshake to get into heaven, right? So Jesus is holding his fingers like that. Can you see that? And so if you were, for example, Orthodox, then you would immediately know what that means, because the Orthodox icons still use this kind of imagery. So even modern saints, or newer saints, would have these kind of weird hand gestures. And so the most important ones, the three most important ones are the following three. And I'm going to do this in the camera, so I hope I can see them. One is like this. Okay, so that's a very common hand gesture that you see a lot of saints or Jesus making. And so what does this signify? This signifies the Trinity. Okay, three fingers together, the Trinity, and the two fingers standing up are the humanity and the divinity of Christ. So the two mysteries, the Trinity and the Incarnation. Okay, what Jesus is doing here is a little bit more fancy, which is this.
So we lost you for just a second.
Fundamentally talk about the same thing. These fingers touching mean dang it, I'm sorry. Okay,
That's okay.
Can you hear me?
And we can hear you now. Just explain what the meaning. We heard the first part. Just,
hello.
Can you hear us?
Perfect. So this kind of yeah. Hand gesture. It talks about the same thing. It's the human name. Okay, merging. Christ says, "I'm both. I'm fully God." You can imagine first, second, entity. And obviously Jesus is wearing blue and red.
So Jan, just because you're going in and out a bit,
his divinity and his humanity. Sometimes it's green and red, signifying the same. Okay, I'm not really doing anything.
No, that's fine. But if you could just, I think you're saying that the two fingers touching is the two fingers
Divinity and humanity.
coming together.
Yeah. Divinity and humanity coming together in Jesus Christ.
Okay.
So the hand gesture in itself is already a moment of evangelization, right? Of preaching, of God teaching us what he is. Fully man and fully God together.
Okay.
Okay. Now we have the Pope Honoris. We already pointed him out. And then underneath the lineup of the all stars, okay, the 12 apostles, obviously all with their name. And then you have Christ again, but this time Christ is hidden. Christ is hidden behind the instruments of his passion. So in the middle, right underneath Christ, you have a cross, and then you have the crown of thorns, you have the nails, you have the chalice, and you have the sponge with the vinegar and the lance with which Christ's side was pierced. So you have the instruments of the passion signifying Christ. And this helps you to understand, okay, like this, I can see Christ in, like he's enthroned, I can see Christ in heaven, but right now we're still on earth, so we can only see Christ behind his, behind an invisible veil, basically, and that is the Eucharist, ultimately, where there is Christ, but you cannot see him as a person. You can only see him as a species bread. I'm gonna close the door here. There's someone crying outside. Okay, good. So I think.
So now I think we're going to a very special altar.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I am most excited to hear your explanation. Everyone is in for quite a treat.
Well, I do have to quote a very good architect and a good friend of mine, James McCreary, who you can Google. He recently finished the Cathedral of Knoxville, Tennessee, and it's quite a gem. So if you do have a time, do Google his work. It's very, very impressive. But he was with me in this basilica, and we walked to this altar, which is the altar of the Assumption. Obviously, you can see the main altar piece, right? You have Jesus crowning Mary in heaven, having assumed her. And there is the Malachite altar that was given by the Tsar of Russia. And so Malachite is a very special stone. It's a very precious stone. It has this kind of turquoise color, right? Which is very rare. And you can see the veining of it is very impressive. It has like a pattern in itself. It's stone. This is not painted. This is original. This is how it occurs, right? In nature. So they built this altar. And so why is this so special? It's a little bit strange of an altar. Usually, and we have spoken about the altar in previous tours, usually the altar is a solid block of stone. And you have the mensa, so the tabletop, on top of that solid rock, fundamentally, right? That's an altar, a solid rock with a mensa on top. And that's where the sacrifice happens. Now, this is weird because you have the mensa, but then you have like a pattern, like an ornament, and then you have the two angels, right? And then you have the front, and the front isn't even on the ground. It actually rests on lions, on winged lions. And you may think, oh, these are just all very beautiful ornaments, right? These are angels and lions, and this is nice. We've seen this before, maybe in other churches. But you have not quite seen this, because what is this, actually? What is this construction that rests on lion or on winged lions or on lions' feet with the angels? It is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, and I think we have an image of it. The Ark of the Covenant had the angels, right, touching with their wings, and then it had lions' feet, which this painter, unfortunately, I didn't realize that when I picked the painting, didn't. But usually it had lions' feet or lion-ass feet. So what happens is you have the Ark of the Covenant with the angels protecting, right? But now, let's go back to the altar. The angels step away and they step next to the altar. And you can see their wings, right? They have curved wings, right? Very strange. And they're holding up the mensa, right? And they have curved wings, and they're leaning on it, kind of, because they have nothing to do anymore. They don't have to protect it anymore. Why? Because the seat of wisdom has been taken. So the ark is now the throne of wisdom. And so the angels don't have to protect it anymore, but they can step back and they can have the seat of wisdom, which is obviously a title of Mary, but then most importantly, during Mass, of Jesus Christ, that that descends and takes his throne on top of the ark. So what you see here is a reconstruction, and it's actually there's only two reconstructions of the Ark of the Covenant used in Baroque or Renaissance art that we know. Well, that I know of, anyways. So it reminds us of the Old and New Testament relation, right? The Ark of the Covenant, which is so important for the Jews, now becoming the seat of wisdom or the throne of wisdom for Jesus Christ. And there we end with St. Paul again, with the relation of Judaism and Christianity, with the Old and the New, with the Old Testament and the New Testament, and Paul preaching this new good news, right? The preaching of Jesus Christ. So at this altar, I usually like to end because this is really kind of a highlight. Yeah, I think we have a couple of minutes for more questions, and then I will unfortunately have to leave you all because I need to get back to packing.
I think there's one thing before we actually officially end. I'd like us to go back to the. This is again the Ark of the Covenant, but let's go back to the tomb. Let's go back to the tomb so we can just take a moment to the tomb of St. Paul and take a moment to pray in silence. We lay our prayers that are deep in our hearts for ourselves and our family and for the great concerns we have for our world today at this tomb. St. Paul, we ask you to intercede for us. St. Paul, pray for us.
Amen.
Amen.